He told me on a Tuesday evening while I was still in my coat from grocery shopping, bags still in my hands. He said it the way you'd mention a change in the weather, casual, almost bored. "Mom, we need you to add Renee to the deed. Her name needs to be on the house." I set the bags down on the kitchen counter, slowly. I didn't look up right away. I just stood there for a moment with my hands pressed flat against the laminate, the cold from outside still in my fingers, and I thought, this is how it starts. My son's name is Garrett. He's 41 years old, and he has his father's nose and his father's way of standing in a doorway like he's already halfway somewhere else. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is named Renee. She's 38, sharp-voiced, and has a way of walking through my house like she's measuring it for furniture she's already ordered. I've lived in this house for 34 years. It's a century home in Kitchener, Ontario, 2 stories, yellow brick with a back garden I've put everything into since the kids left. My late husband Douglas and I bought it the year Garrett started kindergarten. Douglas passed 6 years ago. I kept the house because it was mine, because we built something here, because the rosebush by the back fence was Douglas's idea and I have no intention of letting anyone near it. I'm 67 years old. I worked for 30 years as a registered nurse at Grand River Hospital. I am not a simple woman. I do not panic easily. But that night, standing in my own kitchen in my coat with the cold air still on me, something shifted. A door closed somewhere inside me that I didn't even know had been open. I said, "We'll talk about this later." And I put away the groceries. They had moved in 14 months before that. Garrett had called me on a Sunday in late winter, the kind of day in February where the sky is the exact color of old dishwater and nothing looks like it will ever be green again. He said Renee had run into some financial difficulties. He didn't say how much. He said they'd had to let their apartment go. They'd been renting in Waterloo, and that they just needed somewhere to land for a few months while they sorted things out. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He's my son. You don't say no to your son on a February Sunday when the sky looks like that. They arrived with 11 boxes, a sectional sofa that didn't fit through my front door without scratching the frame, and a small, entitled energy that I told myself I was imagining. The first month was fine. Or fine enough. Renee cooked sometimes. Garrett fixed the light fixture in the upstairs bathroom that I'd been meaning to call someone about for 2 years. We ate dinner together most nights. I told myself this was actually nice, that empty houses are overrated, that this was family. By the 3rd month, Renee had rearranged my kitchen. I came downstairs one morning, and the mugs were in a different cupboard, the cutting boards had moved, and the spice rack I'd had since the late 90s, a wooden one Douglas had made in the garage, had been put in the basement. Renee said it looked cluttered. She said it with a smile that didn't include her eyes. I moved the spice rack back upstairs. She moved it back down. We never spoke directly about it. That was its own kind of language. By the 5th month, she had started referring to my house as our place when she was on the phone with her friends. I heard her once coming in from the garden. "Yeah, our place has this big backyard. It's actually really nice in the summer." I stood on the back step with my gardening gloves still on, and I didn't go inside for a while. Garrett didn't see it. Or he saw it and decided not to. He'd always been like that, capable of enormous loyalty to one thing at the expense of noticing everything else. When he was a teenager, he could focus on a hockey game so completely that you could drop a pot in the kitchen and he wouldn't flinch. Now that focus had turned to keeping Renee comfortable. I understood it, in the way you understand something that still hurts. By the 8th month, I found out about the debt. It wasn't from Garrett. It was from my neighbor Gord, who is semi-retired and has a brother-in-law in finance. He mentioned it in the way that neighbors mention things they assume you already know, carefully, sideways. He said he'd heard Renee had some significant credit issues. He said significant, like he was being delicate. I looked into it myself. I still had a friend from the hospital who knew how to find things. What I found was not a small number. Renee had accumulated close to $400,000 in personal debt. Some of it was business-related, a catering company she'd tried to start and had to dissolve. Some of it was credit. Some of it I didn't fully understand, and the parts I didn't understand worried me more than the parts I did. I did not say anything to Garrett. Not then. I went to my room that night, and I sat on the edge of my bed. Douglas's side was still the left side. I've never moved to it, and I thought about that number for a long time. $400,000. I thought about what that meant, what it could touch, what it could reach if it was attached to my address. I called my lawyer the next morning. Her name is Susan, and she's been handling my affairs since Douglas passed. I told her what I knew. She told me to come in. I did. That appointment was the beginning of the only plan I've ever made in my life that I didn't tell anyone about. The Tuesday evening in my kitchen, when Garrett asked me to put Renee on the deed that was month 14. I had spent those 14 months watching, learning the shape of what was happening. Garrett was not a cruel person. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. He was not cruel. He was captured. There's a difference, though. From the inside of it, it can feel the same. He loved Renee completely, and without reservation, the way some people love things that are not good for them. I had seen this love make him smaller month by month. He used to call me every Sunday. Then, every other Sunday. Then, barely. He used to ask how the garden was doing, whether the heirloom tomatoes had come in, whether I'd been to see his sister's kids. He stopped asking. His world had narrowed to the width of Renee's approval, and I was outside that width. The night he asked about the deed, we sat at the kitchen table after dinner. Renee was in the living room. I could hear the television. Garrett laid it out plainly. He said Renee needed to establish some credit history in Canada. She'd lived in the U.S. for several years before they married, and her Canadian credit was thin. He said the bank had suggested that having her name on an asset would help. He said it would only be partial. He said it was temporary. He said a lot of things. They were not lies, exactly. They were arrangements of truth designed to make a large thing sound small. I said, and her debts. If her name is on this house and she has outstanding creditors, what happens to my house? He looked at me the way children look at their parents when they've asked a question the child wanted to avoid. A look that is not quite irritation and not quite shame. Somewhere in between. That's not how it works, he said. Tell me how it works then. He couldn't, not clearly. Because the truth is that he didn't fully know, and that not knowing was something Renee had probably been counting on. Renee came into the kitchen then. She poured herself a glass of water, leaned against the counter. She said, with the tone of someone raising a reasonable point, "It's a lot to ask, I know, but Garrett's been here helping you for over a year. It would be good for all of us to have something more formal." I looked at her. I kept my face still. I have 30 years of keeping my face still. I worked overnight shifts in emergency for a decade, and you learn what stillness is for. "I'll think about it," I said. I had already thought about it. I had been thinking about it for 6 months. Susan had helped me put several things in order. The house was already in a trust I'd set up after Douglas died, which I had quietly modified 3 months before that Tuesday kitchen conversation. The trust named my daughter, my younger child, who lives in Halifax, as the sole beneficiary. It also included a clause that would complicate enormously any attempt to transfer, encumber, or otherwise alter the property without my direct, independent, legally witnessed consent. Susan had added language that made it very clear whose house this was and how protected it was, and what would happen if anyone tried to lean on it. I hadn't told anyone. Not my daughter, not Gord next door, not my sister in Sudbury. I had also, quietly, over those same months, consulted a second lawyer about Renee's debt situation specifically. What I had learned was that if her name ever appeared on my deed, certain creditors, depending on the nature of the debt, which was not uncomplicated, could potentially make claims against the property. Not guaranteed, not certain, but possible. Possible enough. Susan said, "You have every right to protect yourself. That's not selfishness, that's sense." She was right, and I knew she was right. But knowing the right thing and doing it are separated sometimes by a long corridor that you have to walk alone at night. And there were nights in those months when that corridor felt very long. After that Tuesday, things changed in a way I can only describe as the air pressure dropping before a storm. You can't point to one moment. You just feel it in your ears. Renee stopped making small talk with me in the mornings. Garrett started coming home later. A cardboard box appeared in the hallway outside my bedroom. My things, from the main bathroom. Renee had moved her products in. She said the lighting was better in there. She said it gently, like she was doing me a favor. A week later, Garrett told me that Renee felt the arrangement wasn't working. He said it carefully. He said maybe I should start thinking about what else might suit me. He meant maybe you should leave. He said it in my kitchen, in the house I've owned for 34 years, with the rose bush his father planted still growing in the back garden. I had a choice in that moment. I could have said all of it out loud. I could have shown him what I knew about Renee's debt, what Susan had helped me prepare, what was already in place. I could have asked him if he had any idea what he was asking his 67-year-old mother to do, leave her own home so his wife could use it as collateral. I could have. I'd thought about saying it. I'd rehearsed parts of it some nights, standing at the kitchen sink after they'd gone to bed. I said, "Let me take a few days." He nodded, relieved in a way that broke my heart and settled something in me at the same time. I called my daughter the next morning. Her name is Sable, and she's 38, a landscape architect and the kind of person who listens before she talks. I told her everything. Not quickly. It took the better part of an hour. 2 cups of tea, and one moment where I had to stop and look out at the garden to collect myself. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, "Mum, come to Halifax." I said, "I'm not being pushed out of my house." She said, "You're not being pushed anywhere. I'm inviting you. Come stay with me for a few weeks. Let the lawyers handle the next part. You don't have to be there for it." I thought about that. I thought about whether leaving was surrendering or whether it was something else. Whether there was a version of strength that looked like walking out a front door with a packed bag while your son and his wife are at work. I decided there was. I left on a Thursday. I'd booked my WestJet flight on the Monday, after I'd spoken to Sable, and I'd called Susan on the Tuesday to confirm everything was in order. She reminded me that I was not required to explain anything to anyone, that I was a homeowner in full legal standing and I was choosing to visit my daughter. That was all. I packed 1 large suitcase and 1 carry-on. I took my important documents, which I'd kept in a fireproof box in my bedroom closet for years. I took the small, framed photo of Douglas from the bedside table, the one where he's in the garden, squinting at the sun, looking irritated at something off-screen that I can't remember now, but that made us both laugh when I took it. I left a short note on the kitchen table. It said that I was visiting family, that the house matters were being handled through my lawyer Susan, and that her contact information was at the bottom of the page. That was all the note said. I drove myself to the airport. I parked in Long Term. I sat in the departures lounge with a Tim Hortons coffee, and I did not cry, which surprised me. I felt something instead that I hadn't felt in 14 months. A stillness. Not the stillness of swallowing something, the other kind. The kind that comes after. The letter arrived at the house 11 days later. Susan's office sent it by registered mail. It was detailed, precise, and left no room for interpretation. It outlined the nature of the trust, the legal protections on the property, the conditions under which Garrett and Renee were occupying the home, and the formal notice that their occupancy arrangement, which had never been a tenancy agreement, had never been signed, had been an informal family arrangement, was now concluded with 60 days to vacate as a courtesy. 60 days. Susan said we could have done 30. I said 60 was fine. I wanted it to be fair, even at the end. Even then, Garrett called me the night he got the letter. I was sitting on Sable's back deck, watching the fog come in off the harbor the way it does in Halifax in the evenings. He was not calm on the phone. He said things that I won't repeat in full because they belong to the moment and not to the permanent record of who he is. I know who my son is. I know what he looked like at 5 years old, building a snow fort with his father. I know what he looked like crying at Douglas's funeral, not bothering to wipe his face because he didn't care who saw. I know he is not only the man who stood in my kitchen and told me to start thinking about leaving, but I also know that love is not a reason to let someone take your house. I let him say what he needed to say. When he stopped, I said, "I love you. The 60 days stands." Susan can answer any further questions. And I hung up. The fog was something that evening. It moved like a slow thought. Sable brought out a second cup of tea without my asking and sat next to me. She didn't say anything. That's the thing about the right people, they know when the most useful thing is to simply be there. I looked out at the water, and I thought about the kitchen in Kitchener, and Douglas's spice rack, and the rosebush, and the 34 years of a life that was mine. I thought about how long I had been quiet, and how much of that quiet was love, and how much of it was fear of losing something that turned out to be more mine than I'd remembered. Here's what I've come to believe. At 67, having worked 30 years in a place where you see people at their most frightened and their most real, nobody gets to call you a burden in your own house. Nobody gets to show up at your table and start measuring your walls. And nobody, not your child, not anyone you love, not anyone you have ever sacrificed anything for, gets to hand you a document to sign and expect you to go quietly. I didn't go quietly. I just went on my own schedule. I went with my important papers and my photo of Douglas and a booked flight and a daughter who answered when I called. That's not leaving. That's the difference between being pushed out and choosing where you go next. The 60 days came and went. Garrett and Renee found an apartment in Waterloo. We have not spoken much since. I believe, in some place deeper than the anger, that we will find our way back to each other eventually. Not to what we were, but to something honest. Something that has room for the truth of what happened. I went home to Kitchener in October. I walked through the front door, and I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, just to stand there. Then I went out to the back garden and I checked on the rosebush. It had done fine without me. Of course it had. Some things know how to survive the winter without being watched. But I was glad to see it. I've thought a lot about what made things go the way they did. Not in a bitter way. More the way you look back at a road you've driven and notice where the curves were. Garrett is not a bad person. I've said that to myself enough times that I know it's true. Not just something I say to feel better. But somewhere in those 14 months, he made a choice, quietly, without drama, to let someone else's comfort matter more than his mother's dignity. That's not cruelty. It's a kind of moral laziness that can look from the inside almost like love. And I think that's the part that took the longest to untangle. Because when someone hurts you in the name of love, you spend a long time wondering if you're allowed to be hurt at all. What I've come to understand is this. The way we treat the people who have no power over us anymore, our parents, our elders, the ones who already gave everything they had, that's where our real character lives. Not in the big moments, in the Tuesday evenings, in whether you notice that your mother's spice rack has been moved to the basement, in whether you say something or decide not to. Renee was not wrong to want stability. She was wrong to reach for mine. And Garrett was not wrong to love her. He was wrong to stop asking whether what he was doing to get her what she wanted was something he could live with. Those are small distinctions. They matter enormously. I think about Susan, my lawyer, and the quiet, practical wisdom she offered me over those months. She never told me what to feel. She told me what was true and what was possible, and she let me decide. That kind of clarity is its own form of kindness. I was lucky to have it. Not everyone does. The plan I made, the trust, the legal protections, the booked flight, didn't come from anger. It came from something I'd spent 30 years learning in a hospital. That you have to know what you're dealing with before you can respond to it, not react. Respond. There's a long distance between those two things, and I've learned to live in that distance. To collect information, to think before I speak, to let people show me who they are without rushing to tell them who I think they are. That's not coldness. It's the hardest kind of discipline I know. And then there was Sable. She said, "Come to Halifax," and she didn't need to say it twice. She didn't try to fix anything or tell me I should have left sooner or ask too many questions. She just made room. That's what the right people do. They don't solve it. They make room. I want to be that kind of person more consistently than I manage to be. What I know for certain, standing on the other side of all of it, is that protecting yourself is not the same as being selfish. Leaving is not the same as losing. And silence, the kind I held for 14 months while I watched and learned and prepared, is not the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is the thing you do while you're getting strong enough to act. The rose bush came back this spring. Douglas planted it in 2003, and it has survived every winter since without much help from anyone. There's something in that I keep coming back to, that the things rooted deeply enough tend to hold on, even when no one is watching, even through seasons that should have finished them. I'm still here. That's the whole of it, really. I'm still here.